The opening moments of Final Fantasy XV are outstanding. After a little narrative preamble, we get this beautiful sun-drenched scene of 4 people pushing a broken down car along a road that seems to stretch infinitely into the horizon. They bicker back and forth with the familiarity that only longtime friends have, and it's a scene that's so simple and even mundane, but one that beautifully captures everything Final Fantasy can be, a massive sweeping journey surrounded by the people you care about. And as a player, this moment was a huge relief. This is Final Fantasy XV, a game that's been in development for 10 years, one that seemed to teeter constantly on the brink of cancellation, but now it's finally here, the newest mainline entry into a series stretching back nearly 30 years, with titles that shaped entire console generations and gave us some of the most iconic and talked about moments in gaming. And as you sit there clutching your controller, watching this scene unfold, it's impossible not to get excited at the promise of what's to come, and in that moment, the 10 years of waiting feel worth it. A new Final Fantasy is here, and everything is going to be okay. I played roughly 12 hours of 15 on my first playthrough, and 4 of those hours felt pretty good. The world was beautiful, the combat system was different but interesting, and I enjoyed the friendship of the 4 protagonists. But slowly, cracks started to appear. Little problems at first, with its world, then its gameplay, then its story, that slowly built up in a way that made me question, was this really the next Final Fantasy? And bizarrely, this was a sentiment that Square Enix, the developers of the game, seemed to share, and they promised future patches to improve everything from its gameplay and performance to even its story. And so I made the decision to put down 15 and resolve not to pick it up again until the game was 100% complete. And so now, I'm sitting here writing this, another 2 years later, having completed Final Fantasy XV, the Royal Edition, and, well, you've seen the title of this video, you know why we're here. There have been improvements to 15, but its problems run so deep and are so severe that I don't think they could ever be patched away. And that sucks because I also see this as a game with some really bold and fascinating ideas. There's traces of something brilliant here, and so I'd like to start with one of those ideas that had so much potential. And that is Final Fantasy XV's open world. Unlike older Final Fantasies that had worlds that gradually opened up as you played through the story, Eos's world opens up nearly immediately, with a go anywhere, do anything ethos to it. And hell yeah, I thought the idea of a massive open world Final Fantasy that I could look across a vast landscape and see Marlboros, Tonberries and Chocobos had me more excited than that time my dad accidentally bought me Wicked City. And what's more, Eos looks gorgeous, a stunning land of incredible views and sweeping vistas, with a lighting engine that dramatically changes the look and feel of your environment depending on what time of day it is. And as you spend the opening hours of the game driving through this world, the sights and sounds really do make it feel like you're on a road trip with 4 friends, and I think it's here where the game is at its strongest. But it's when you start to look past Eos's incredible sights and sweeping vistas that this beautiful world begins to fall apart. I see world building a lot like I see character writing. In the same way a good character design isn't a substitute for good character writing, a well-modeled landscape isn't a substitute for world building. Just like a well-written character, a good world should have a sense of personality, history, and maybe most importantly, a believable sense of logic that becomes more pronounced the more time you spend with them. And so, with that in mind, I want to ask a question. The 2 defining aspects of Eos as an open world are, 1, it's inhabited by people who have built cities and settlements all across its landscape, and 2, that same landscape is also inhabited by large aggressive monsters who roam freely throughout its countryside. So my question is, Monsters being real, why don't any of Eos's cities or settlements have walls? Okay, I know right now I sound like the xylophone guy from The Simpsons, but hear me out here. If you're going to believe in a fictional place, it's important for that place to have a fictional integrity that would logically form from whatever rules govern that world. If a land has a lot of lakes, you're going to see a fishing culture develop. If deposits of ore are common, then you're going to see mining towns spring up. And so, if monsters were part of a landscape, wouldn't protecting settlements from such creatures be a natural part of life? But none of Eos's cities have any kind of fortification against such danger. And by extension of that, if the threat of monster attacks was always a concern, would you not see that anxiety considered in every aspect of daily life? You'd imagine armor and protective gear would be a lot more common, as would reinforcing vehicles against monster attacks, which in turn could have been a great opportunity to express the world in the fashion and character design of its NPCs. Take these NPC designs from Final Fantasy XIII, and look at how much you can glean about their world and culture just from these concept sketches. And by comparison, that same sense of world building is completely absent from the NPC designs of Final Fantasy XV. And if it sounds like I'm just picking holes in minor details, well, it's in the details that worlds are built. For example, Dragon Quest XI, which recently released, has the same free-roaming monster problem as 15. However, each town in Dragon Quest is noticeably fortified against such attacks because at some point the developers sat down and considered what it would be like to live in this world. And by extension of that ethos, each town has its own distinct culture that you can see in everything, from the layout of the towns themselves to the designs of its buildings, right down to the town's history, which can be read about in books. Let's take another entirely different example of this. One of the coolest aspects of Monster Hunter World is watching the different monsters encounter each other organically out in the wild and fight for territory. And this is so awesome, not just because watching monsters fight is, well, rad, but because it conveys that there is an ecosystem and food chain entirely separate from the player, which in turn helps create the illusion of an immersive, breathing world. And again, it's the same ethos behind Dragon Quest's walls. The developers considered what it would be like to live in this world and how the natural wildlife would interact. And by contrast, in Final Fantasy, it's as if the developers thought about how the players interact with the monsters, how the players interact with the humans, but not how these two elements of their world would interact or affect each other. And it's that lack of consideration that makes Eos feel more like an artificial space filled with enemies and NPCs, rather than an organic, lived-in world inhabited by monsters and people. Everything we've talked about up until now has been about how Eos fails to create a believable fictional world, but where these problems compound is when we look at the actual game that's been built on top of it. And I don't even mean the battle system, we'll get to that. I mean that Eos is also an environment that doesn't feel designed with player interaction in mind. One of the reasons Eos looks so gosh dang beautiful is how vast the world actually is. It's constructed from these massive swaths of land that combine to create these incredible views that seem to stretch on forever, creating a tremendous sense of scale as you drive through it. The problem though is that the world is so large that vast swaths of it are completely devoid of any meaningful content, which becomes apparent as soon as you step out of the car and start traversing the game's barren lands on foot. And worse, some of the game design actually de-incentivizes you from finding what little is actually out there. For example, spread throughout the map of 15 are designated points where Noctis and crew can set up camp, with some camp spots triggering tours, short side quests or cutscenes involving Noctis and one of the game's other party members going on a small excursion. And while not especially memorable or well done, they do offer a nice change of pace to the grind of car rides and dungeon crawls. The problem though is that the design of the game actually directs you away from finding these tours. You have the option to stay at different lodgings throughout 15, And it's only by doing this you can cash in the experience points earned from battle, with each lodging carrying an experience multiplier. The fancier the lodgings, the higher your XP bonus will be, so a nice hotel will give you 3 times the experience a regular lodging would, and so you're always going to be aiming to stay at lodgings that offer the highest XP bonus. The problem being that campgrounds offer the lowest experience points in the game, meaning you're throwing away experience whenever you choose to stay at them, which in turn de-incentivizes you from visiting the very campgrounds that will trigger these cutscenes. In fact, I actually went through my entire main playthrough of the game without experiencing a single tour. Compare that to something like Breath of the Wild, which was designed that no matter what point of the map you're standing, there would always be points of interest on the horizon for you to go and explore, meaning a player's natural curiosity will end up pulling them around the map and even lead them to optional discoveries like Eventide Island, arguably the best content of the entire game. And by comparison, there is no design to 15's world. But I think maybe the much bigger problem is that once you do find the side content of 15, it's just not that interesting. One of the more memorable side quests I did involved searching for a royal arm, one of the game's 13 legendary weapons hidden in tombs around Eos. I went to its supposed location only to find that it had been stolen from its tomb, which was a pretty intriguing setup. I then travelled to a nearby dungeon, which looked pretty cool from the outside, but then had the same dungeon tileset as a lot of the game's other locations, and that was until I found my way to a high-tech elevator, which brought me down into a sci-fi neon laboratory, where I then fought a dragon who, once defeated, dropped the royal arm I was looking for, and it was like, wait, what happened here? Did the dragon steal the royal arm? And why is there a lab under this dungeon? How did any of this tie together? But there is no answer to those questions. There's no story here at all. Just a bunch of video game assets that feel crafted in isolation and were slotted together afterwards without any narrative or logic. In fact, I know that's the case because this dragon is actually from the portfolio of XPEC, a Taiwanese-based middleware and assets developer. And it's just like, man, you can do so much with side quests in games, and this just felt so underdeveloped and half-hearted. Like, take for example how side quests are handled in Nier Automata. Each side quest in Automata centers around encounters with NPCs who themselves are struggling with the same themes of identity and existentialism that are so central to Automata's story, the game using these side narratives to further explore those ideas. Or a simpler example with Yakuza, how it uses side quests to both flesh out the city and culture of Kamurocho while letting us see a completely different side of Kiryu. See my video on Yakuza for more of a discussion on that. For both these games, I couldn't tell you a single reward any of these side quests gave me, but it doesn't matter because of how the narratives they presented were satisfying experiences in and of themselves. And by contrast, that same sense of narrative or purpose is absent from the side content of 15. But here's the thing, that side quest with the Science Dragon, that was the best side quest I played in the entire game, and I use it because I don't want people to think I'm misrepresenting the quality of this game. But in actuality, the vast majority of side quests were so much worse. And I'm not even talking about the fucking cup noodle side quest. Okay, I enjoy some good ironic advertising humor, but this is a paid advertisement for a real-life product in your fantasy game that you paid for! Oh god, sorry. No, what I'm referring to in its lesser content are instances like this. Around halfway through the game, I completed one of the main story quests, which involved me going down into a dungeon and fighting a unique boss. Later on in the game, I decided to take a break from the main story and take on one of the game's hunts. Basically, side quests where you hunt a specific monster. Only to find then that that side quest sent me down the exact same dungeon I had just beaten, ending in the exact same boss fight. In other words, it was a copy and paste of the same story mission but disguised as a side quest. I understand that asset reuse is an unavoidable part of video game development, but instances like this are so rampant in 15 that it destroys the fictional credibility of its world, whether it be the animations that play out through cutscenes or the very environments themselves. Throughout Eos, there's dotted all these little crow's nest diners, and the first time you enter one, it's really cool and charming. They're really nicely designed and they lend well to the game's road trip theme. The only issue being that these diners are copied and pasted all across Eos, all having the exact same layout and geometry. And I understand these are meant to be a chain, but that doesn't excuse the exact copy and paste crooked artwork on the walls at every single one. Later on in the game, I experienced something that brought this problem to a ludicrous crescendo. I was in one of the game's 2 diner designs inspecting a model of an NPC, only to suddenly realize that he was having dinner with himself. I thought this was pretty funny before turning to leave, only to find another version of the same man sitting behind me. And with things quickly starting to feel like I'd fallen into an episode of The Twilight Zone, I began to make my way out of the diner when a 4th man with a different head but the same body walked in. Okay, I partially bring up this story because I think it's hilarious, but also because along with everything else we've talked about, it shows that both in its fiction and its construction, there's a believability to Eos that just isn't there. Which means at best, Eos feels like a beautiful piece of geometry, and at worst, it's an ill-considered collection of assets that never coalesces into a meaningful whole. I want to now move on to the combat of Final Fantasy XV. Combat is a really important part of RPGs. In a lot of ways, it's the center of the entire experience, the part of the game that drives you to build up your characters and explore the world, taking on new and more difficult challenges. And so if a battle system doesn't work, it negatively impacts the entire rest of the game. And so before we get into 15 specifically, I want to first establish a baseline for what a good RPG battle system is. And to do that, I want to look at 2 specific encounters from previous Final Fantasies that always really stuck with me. The first is from Final Fantasy VI against the demon octopus Ultros, and what's so cool about this fight is that Ultros hits way harder than your low-level party can take, and so he's nearly impossible, and that is until you realise you need to move your party members to the back row, meaning that they will take less damage, and in turn Ultros can no longer kill them in a single hit, which allows you to heal them, giving you a fighting chance against the overpowered octopus. Likewise, there's a really cool fight at the start of Final Fantasy VIII where you fight this monstrous T-Rex, and again, he's able to hit way harder than your baby characters can survive. And he seems unbeatable, but it's only when you realise that he's vulnerable to blind status magic that all his attacks start to miss, rendering the rest of the fight a cakewalk. What's so awesome about both these fights to me is that they both subtly tell the player through nothing but gameplay that there's elements to combat a player will need to consider beyond just attacking and healing. And that to me has always been the mark of a good RPG battle system. Now, keep that in mind as we talk about the combat from 15. 15's combat was a huge departure from the turn-based active time battles of old and even from the real-time combat of 12, shifting the focus of encounters from strategy to something that much more closely resembles a character action game, at least on the surface. And so before we look at 15 as an RPG, I want to first talk about it as an action game. There's this formula I really like from Soren Johnson, the lead game designer on Civilization 4, that states that a player's total fun is equal to meaningful decisions over time played. And while it's maybe a little general, you can see how it applies to a wide variety of game types, as well as shedding light on why series like Devil May Cry have such a dedicated following, as combat encounters typical to those titles potentially require players to make dozens of minor but meaningful decisions over the course of a few seconds, based on everything from a player's position relative to an enemy, attack animation, and even frame data. These are the decisions that make it fun. My problem with 15 as an action game is it's constantly taking that decision-making process away from the player. Distance, enemy type, attack animation, you don't need to consider any of this while attacking in 15. To initiate an attack, all the player needs to do is hold down the attack button, and this will auto-track Noctis to the nearest enemy, pick which attack animation to use depending on distance, start the attack combo, end that combo, and then even move Noctis on to the next enemy once the initial one was defeated, all without any additional input from the player. Which means, with no exaggeration, you can get through a significant portion of the game's encounters just by holding the attack button. In fact, all the footage you've been watching on screen so far has been me just holding a single attack button and nothing else. I played the game on normal difficulty, and I never went out of my way to XP grind or gain any additional advantages, and the footage on screen now is from the final dungeon of the game. And the problem isn't that it's too easy, it's that it doesn't require any real engagement from the player. And that's a problem not unique to the simpler enemies. There's also major story-related boss battles in the game where Noctis will go Super Saiyan, which looks amazing, but again, all you're actually doing is just holding circle. And it creates this jarring disconnect between Noctis's animations and the actual input of the player. It frequently looks like you're doing amazing things in 15, but it rarely feels like it. And a lot of the game's other mechanics work like this. They actively take the decision-making process out of the hands of the player. Take Link Strikes, for example. These are stylish animations that can trigger whenever Noctis performs a successful backstab or parry near one of his allies. But you don't actually have control over when this happens because you don't have any control over the positioning of your party members, completely eliminating that mechanic as a tactical option. And it's also the same for the game's summons, where the player calls upon one of Eos's 6 gods to come down and aid them in battle. And while these look amazing, the player doesn't actually get to decide when they happen. Rather, randomly in fights, an icon will appear on screen letting you know you can summon, and then you can summon them or not. But they are so rare that it actually only triggered twice throughout my entire mainline playthrough. And while this makes sense from a narrative perspective, they are gods after all, in terms of gameplay, it's just another decision that's taken away from the player. And if you found yourself getting bored during Final Fantasy XV's combat, this is why. The game doesn't ask you to make the decisions to be actually engaging. Even parries, a mechanic that in other games requires skill and timing to pull off, which can be difficult but has also led to some of the hypest moments in gaming history, are simplified down to a quick time event, meaning that you don't even have to be looking at an enemy to parry them. Which brings us to the defensive options of Final Fantasy XV, which come with their own issues. The main way a player defends in 15 is by holding the phase button, which allows Noctis to phase through enemy attacks, but frustratingly it doesn't work on every attack, like area of effect attacks, and it's for those second non-phasable attacks the player is meant to use the dodge roll, and frustratingly there's no visual indication of when you should phase and when you should dodge roll, meaning sometimes you'll try to phase through an attack only to have it land, which can make trying to plan your defense in 15 often feel like an ill-considered crapshoot. And this is only made worse by how poor a job the camera does of framing the action, especially when you're either in a tight environment or fighting more than 3 enemies, where battles will often grow so clustered that it can be difficult to pull out any visual information at all to help you decide on what action to take, meaning you're going to end up eating a lot of hits that you had no real way of preparing for. But in a way, the amount of damage you take in 15 doesn't actually matter. In fact, a lot of Final Fantasy XV's mechanics don't matter. I could talk about the teamwork attacks, the Amigar state, or the game's magic system, and I have some real fucking problems with that magic system. But honestly, I don't see much of a point considering how they're all invalidated by our next topic. Up until now, my criticisms of 15 have been on the grounds that it's an action game, and I could see a possible counter-argument to that being that it's not an action game, it's an RPG. And while I disagree with that, I think it's when you look at the game as an RPG that 15's combat breaks entirely. In traditional turn-based RPGs, using healing items takes up a character's entire turn. That's a turn they could have been attacking or buffing or whatever else. In other words, there's an opportunity cost to healing that forces the player to think about when to use it. But because the player's actions are not limited to turns in 15, it means there is no opportunity cost to using a healing item, essentially eliminating that dynamic. which means you can heal whenever you want without penalty. And where this becomes game-breaking is how it overlaps with the game's death system. Typically in RPGs, a character has a single health bar, and when their hit points reach 0, they die. But Noctis has 2 health bars, his current HP and his total HP. When his current HP reaches 0, he enters a critical state, in which his actions are limited to using items and his total HP starts to drain, and only when his total HP reaches 0 does he enter a final death state. The issue though is that upon entering critical state, Noctis is actually granted a short period of invulnerability, during which he can use a health item to return to a normal status, meaning you can basically revive indefinitely as long as your supply of health items last. And considering how cheap potions come in Final Fantasy, you can purchase 99 for just under 5,000 gil, which is less money than you can get from some early side quests. A little foresight ensures you'll never run out of potions, meaning you should never actually enter the death state. And even if you do, you're still given another few seconds of invulnerability to use a Phoenix Down, which will restore you to full health. This completely removes all challenge from 15's combat. The defining factor isn't your skill, your strategy, or even your level. It's how many health items do you have in your inventory and how long are you willing to wait for an enemy to die. I wanted to put this theory to the test, and so the footage you're watching on screen now is sped up footage of me fighting the Adamantoise, an optional endgame boss with 5 million HP who can KO your entire party with a single attack. I fought him as soon as the quest became available, just with the equipment I had on hand and not with any specific character builds. And yet, over the course of an extremely tedious 2 hours and 10 minutes, I was able to whittle down his health using nothing more than the game's most basic mechanics and spamming potions. I've seen some people suggest that this isn't an exploit, that this is just the tactic you use to beat Adamantoise, to which I would say that same tactic worked for every encounter in the story, including some optional endgame bosses. And so, as an action game, Final Fantasy XV doesn't give you the decision-making options that would have actually made it fun. And as an RPG, the system is so broken that a player can completely destroy its game balance with just a basic knowledge of attacking and healing. And I could see the argument for, if exploits like this are ruining the experience, then just don't use them. But what I would say to that is that a good game should teach you how to play it, and it's not the player's job to balance the game for the developer. So both in its open world and its combat system, there's a tangible lack of quality in 15, which leaves us only with the game's story. And it's in the story where my biggest issue with the game lies. But before I get to that particular problem, I want to quickly cover some of the more basic story issues I had with the game that don't feel big enough to give their own section, but I also can't bring myself to cut. So here is a very brief rundown of some basic story issues I had with 15. 15's story can't decide if it wants to be a fantasy epic, a coming-of-age narrative, or a love story, and it feels unfocused because of it. Having a crystal that dictates who is good and who is evil robs the characters of agency, and finally, I know people are going to go fucking nuts in the comments over this one, but I think the story would have been more interesting with a more diverse cast, and I don't say that out of any social obligation, but because as long as I've known it, Final Fantasy has been a series about a group of weirdos from wildly different backgrounds and cultures all coming together to combat a greater evil, and I've always thought that was a cool message. And I feel like you lose that when your entire party is 4 guys who all grew up in the same city. There. None of these are deal breakers, none of these are my main problem with 15's story, but to discuss my main problem, I want to first have a little talk about additional content in games. My general guiding rule with additional content, be it DLC or whatever else, is to ask the question, did the developer provide a satisfying and complete experience with their base game, and if yes, then I will happily pay for additional content. One of my favourite examples from this is the Artorias of the Abyss DLC from the original Dark Souls. I know this is a very controversial opinion to express in a YouTube video game essay, but I think Dark Souls is quite good. So much so in fact that when the Artorias of the Abyss DLC came out, I was happy to pay for it. The DLC centers around Artorias, a character who is hinted at in the main game, but for all the player knows, he's just another of Dark Souls' enigmatic historical figures, which makes it all the more satisfying in the DLC when you discover Artorias is still alive, a fallen hero who now lies broken and corrupted by the darkness he had once sought to suppress, creating a tense emotional boss fight and one of the best encounters of the entire series. Dark Souls is satisfying with or without the Artorias DLC, the DLC only shining a light on a corner of Dark Souls' world you didn't know existed. And so it doesn't fix anything in the main game, it just adds to it. And I don't think that's an unreasonable standard to hold additional content to. Now, let's apply that same standard to Final Fantasy XV. When we begin Final Fantasy XV, the characters speak with a familiarity that implies they already know each other, and have done for a number of years. And if I was to level a criticism just at Final Fantasy XV's base game, it would be that that history is never properly explored. Thus, we're not given the context to understand or relate to the relationship that's formed between these characters. And considering the theme of Final Fantasy XV is bonds between people, I'd consider that a major failing of the game's narrative. But here's the thing, that history does exist, just not in the game itself. It is instead segregated into the 6-episode Brotherhood anime. And the anime is actually fine for what it is, and in fairness to Square, it's all available for free on their YouTube, but the problem isn't one of costs. The choice to express the character's history in a separate piece of content is also a choice to remove that same content from the game itself. Meaning that the game was designed with this gap in narrative intentionally, and it's worse because of it. What if instead you learned more about these characters and their relationship by just playing the game, either through the main story or its side quests? It would allow the game to slowly reveal who these characters are, and by virtue, create a more natural relationship between them and the player, which could also potentially provide some much needed meaningful content for the game's open world itself. But by making the decision to segregate this part of the game's story into its own content, we'd never get to experience that. So even if it's freely available, separating the story content from the main game like this hurts the game as a whole. If you're wondering if I'm doing that thing where I bring up a very minor problem to help segue into a much larger section, then yes, I am. There are 3 points throughout 15's story where a party member will become separated from the group and rejoin them at a later stage. The question of where they go or what happened to them only being answered by paying $5 a piece for the additional Gladio, Prompto, and Ignis DLC packs. For the moment, I'm gonna put aside how grossly anti-consumer I think this is. The issue isn't even the DLC itself. In fact, it's actually some of the best content of the entire game, with a much simpler but sharper focus than the main story and some really nice pieces of character developments. It even sidesteps the main game's infinite healing problem by giving you a set number of healing items, which in turn forces you to learn each character's unique gameplay mechanics in a way that the main game just doesn't. Episode Prompto in particular was a standout. It has well-directed cutscenes, a positively banging soundtrack, and even fleshes out Aranea, the most underutilized character of the game, as she helps Prompto realize he is actually the result of a Niflheim genetic experiment, causing him to question his entire identity and making him doubt the bond that's formed between him and the others. And it's good, it feels distinct, it's well directed, it made me give a shit about Prompto, which is impressive. The only problem is that this is Prompto's entire emotional arc, which outside this DLC is nearly entirely absent from the main game, with this critical piece of character development being condensed to a few scant shreds of dialogue and then forgotten. And it's the same with Gladio and Ignis. Essentially, their entire arcs are suppressed into these hour-and-a-half-long chunks of paid DLC, which in turn tears that same character development out of the main game, so there's no opportunity to develop them naturally over the course of 15's story. And so you either spend the entire game without any real development or progression of the game's central cast, or you pay Square to fix that problem for you with $5 DLC packs. Square have stated that this content was not cut from the main game but is instead purely additional, But whether the content was cut or not is irrelevant. The fact is that this game was designed from the ground up with these gaps in the story in mind, with the intention of making the player pay extra money to see them. And yet still, there is a worse example of this. But to discuss it properly, we need to go over Final Fantasy's basic story premise. Noctis is the Prince of Lucius, the last kingdom of Eos that has not fallen to the technologically advanced Niflheim Empire, due mostly to the efforts of Noctis' father, King Regis, who has poured his life force into generating a shield around his kingdom, preventing a Niflheim invasion. Events are set in motion when Niflheim proposed an arranged marriage between Noctis and Lady Lunafreya, the former princess of Altissia, a country that fell to Niflheim during a childhood visit from Noctis, with the arranged marriage potentially bringing an end to the war that has raged between the two kingdoms for 12 years. So, when we join Noctis at the start of the game, he, Gladio, Prompto, and Ignis are about to set off to Altissia, where Noctis' bride awaits. And you know what, I think that's actually a pretty strong setup, even if you really do have to dig for some of that lore in the game's extra menus. But then, about 2 hours in, things take a disastrous turn, both for our characters and the quality of the storytelling. Noctis and crew are about to board a boat to Altissia when we get this 75-second cutscene with no sound effects and a jarringly different visual style to the rest of the game. It shows characters we've never seen and locations we've never been, punctuated by scenes of chaos before finally we see King Regis stabbed. We then get another scene, this time an in-game cutscene, where Noctis and the others learn from a newspaper that the incident we just saw was Niflheim destroying Insomnia, the crown city of Lucius, and killing King Regis, with the wedding just being a pretense for all this. This is a world-shattering event in 15's story, one that shifts the entire political landscape of Eos and a tragic turning point for Noctis as a character. And yet it's conveyed with a clumsiness that upon your first time viewing makes it genuinely difficult to understand exactly what's happening, which undercuts any sense of drama or tragedy the scene should have. This should have been the moment that everyone talks about when they talk about Final Fantasy XV. It should have been the death of Eris from 7 or the apocalypse from 6. But instead, we're not given the information or context to empathize with the tragedy of this scene, nor is it directed with the skill to really convey those emotions. It feels like an afterthought, and the reason for that is because the actual fall of Insomnia, the key central plot event that drives the rest of the story, actually takes place in the separate Kingsglaive feature-length movie. The movie opened in 2016 in the run-up to the game's release, and centers around the fall of Insomnia through the viewpoint of an order of Lucian knights known as the Kingsglaive, and it serves a number of critical functions in terms of 15's fiction. For one, it establishes the Kingdom of Lucius as an actual place with its own culture and way of life. 2, it communicates the sheer magnitude of the destruction of Insomnia that the game completely fails to do, which in turn shows us just how much Noctis has lost, as well as how dangerous the Niflheim actually are. The problem again being that once you segregate this content from the main game, it hurts the narrative as a whole. Let's for a second imagine an alternate reality Final Fantasy XV, where the events of Kingsglaive are woven into the game itself. Just imagine you spend the first several hours exploring the kingdom of Lucius as Noctis, getting to know its people and culture, maybe even using that time to establish a relationship between Noctis and Regis, an aspect bizarrely absent from the main game aside from pre-release trailers. And then imagine how incredible it would be to leave the walls of Insomnia and be let out into the open world of Eos, and the feeling of freedom that would accompany that first car ride. And how devastating it would be to learn that Insomnia, the city you had spent the first several hours of the game, has been wiped off the face of the earth along with King Regis and every character in it. And now you have context. Now you're in a position to empathize with Noctis' feelings of grief because you have lived what he has lost. I understand that my solution here is basically to build an entirely new part of the game, one that would require thousands upon thousands of man hours and millions upon millions of dollars. And maybe that's unreasonable. Maybe it's not fair of me to expect Square to create an entirely new environment and story section just to give the game's later narrative context and weight. Except that's exactly what they did with Midgar for the first several hours of Final Fantasy VII. Up until now, I've been trying to avoid comparing 15 to any of the other Final Fantasy games because I don't want to come across like the bitter Final Fantasy fanboy that I no doubt am. I've made several suggestions while discussing 15's story in ways that I feel it could be improved, but the truth is, these are all just elements I've pulled from past Final Fantasy games. There are 12 mainline, story-focused, single-player Final Fantasy games, all of which tell their stories without a need for additional content, all of which establish a relationship between their characters and then develop those characters over the course of the game and convey the strife, struggle, and ultimate triumph of these characters with a weight and emotion that made these stories immortal. And so I have to ask, why now, after 30 years of Final Fantasy, is it okay to cut out the heart of these stories and divide it out across different pieces of content, and then not only ask consumers to pay additional fees for that content, but to ignore how detrimental doing so is to the story itself? Why does every part of this game, from its world building to its combat to its narrative, feel compromised and ill-considered, and why is that now acceptable as Final Fantasy? Throughout this video, I've been very hard on 15, and I acknowledge that, and I don't expect everyone to take the same issues with the game that I do, but I also see it as my job to be as honest as I can about the media I care about. Truthfully, I don't hate Final Fantasy 15. There are parts of it I enjoyed. Sneaking through the mist and seeing the silhouette of a behemoth on the horizon was a beautiful moment that felt like the cross between a coming-of-age story and a traditional Final Fantasy that this game is so clearly trying to be. And likewise, I thought when Ignis lost his eyesight and how that changed the dynamic of the party, that was a really painful, powerful moment. As was the photograph resting on the throne in that final scene. And it's moments like this that make me see what this game could have been. So I want to end this video by asking a question. What happened to Final Fantasy 15? And to answer that, we need to go back to 2006 and to the development of a group of games called Fabula Nova Crystallis Final Fantasy. Nova Crystallis was the name given to a subset of Final Fantasy games that, while not existing in the same universe, shared a mythos that tied the different titles together. The flagship of these was Final Fantasy XIII, which in 2006 was still 3 years from releasing, with other games that would include 2 sequels to 13, Final Fantasy Type 0, and a curious little title called Final Fantasy Versus 13. Versus was the brainchild of Tetsuya Nomura, a character designer at Square who had rose to prominence after his work on the Kingdom Hearts series. And within Versus, Nomura saw a bold new vision for Final Fantasy. He wanted to craft a more realistic and far darker story than what had come before. He envisioned a somber world where characters worshipped gods of death and blood was openly spilled in the streets, in battles of spectacular scale and beauty, completely unlike anything the series had seen before, that could flow seamlessly from one environment to the next, taking place everywhere from the depths of the ocean to the sides of a skyscraper. And a story that would have no cutscenes. The narrative would be woven seamlessly into the gameplay. And so in 2006, the game was revealed and announced to be coming to PlayStation 3, accompanied by a stunning trailer featuring a dark-haired protagonist cutting his way through scores of enemies, whose name was later revealed to be Noctis. Despite the initial excitement, things grew strangely quiet for Versus after that, with it being absent from industry trade shows throughout 2007 and 2008. Nomura would later claim that the reason for this silence was that his team had been transferred to work on the upcoming Final Fantasy XIII, which was suffering its own troubled development cycle, but Square would later refute that statement, blaming the comment on a mistranslation. The drought of information would end on August 8th, 2008, when a brand new trailer was unveiled at a Square Enix fan event. One showing Noctis, now accompanied by 3 friends, as they rode through a barren and desolate landscape, and most notably, a brand new female character who bore a rapier, who in some scenes seemed friendly with Noctis and in others adversarial, leading to fan speculation about the nature of their relationship. Excitement for Versus was once again high, but over the next 3 years, only scant pieces of information saw public light. And in 2011, development of the game, which by now had begun 5 years ago, was revealed to still be in pre-production, with rumours of the game's deeply troubled development cycle beginning to stir. 2 more years passed, and by 2013, Versus 13 had become a ghost of industry trade shows, a silent shadow that hung over every Square Enix press conference. Nomura even commenting on a podcast that its development is a delicate situation within the company, causing rumours of the game's cancellation to run rampant. But then, finally, after 5 years of near silence, a bomb drops. Versus receives a brand new, dramatically different trailer at E3 2013, showing a vastly different game than what had come before, and at the end of the trailer, shockingly, Versus 13 is rebranded as Final Fantasy 15. The next mainline game in the series, with it no longer being bound for PS3, but now instead the next generation hardware of PS4 and Xbox One. And with this new console development came a dramatic change in staff, with a new writer, a new producer, and most notably, a new co-director in the form of Hajime Tabata. Tabata would later comment that when he arrived on the project, he was met with a staff that, I quote, were exhausted and fretful. Keep in mind that at this point they had been working on the game for 7 years. That's 7 years of half-finished ideas and concepts that failed to solidify. A character designer on the project later speaking about how disorganized the staff were, how staff were frequently having the rug pulled out from under them by a story that would shift and change every 3 or 4 months. And it's hard not to feel from reading reports that Nomura's unchecked ambition was a big part of this. According to some sources, he at one point marched into Square Enix's head office and demanded that the game be changed to a musical after being inspired by Hugh Jackman and Anne Hathaway in their performances in Les Mis, and at another, wanted the characters to be able to pilot mechs during battle. Square was keen to stress that the game was not competing for internal resources with the upcoming Kingdom Hearts 3, but despite this, a year later, Nomura, whose vision had been the driving force behind the project since its beginning, was transferred to be the full-time director of Kingdom Hearts 3, with Tabata taking on the role of full director. And his objective was clear. Stating in an interview with FinalLand.com, "We can't keep people waiting beyond 2016. We have to get the game out in the best possible state it can be and within the budget we've set." And so, massive swaths of the game were cut, such as the narrative elements being integrated into the gameplay, the battle system that could take place on multiple different environments, with even massive story changes, such as the character of Stella being completely discarded, replaced with the far more demure Luna Freya, as well as toning down the darker elements of the game with less violence and the removal of the death gods. Transferring development to the new platforms of Xbox One and PS4 also brought its own hardships, with the engine changing from Crystal Tools to Luminous, meaning that huge chunks of the work already done would have to be left behind. Furthermore, Luminous was an untested, unfinished internal engine, with Square having to actively develop it as they used it to create Final Fantasy XV. Causing large amounts of Final Fantasy XV to be outsourced to several other studios around the world, such as Plus Smile, Hexadrive, X-Pac, with middleware from Umbra and technical development from Streamlined Studios. All as the game barreled towards its September 30th release date, only for it to be delayed one last time, a month out from its launch, finally releasing on November 29th, 2016, 10 years after its initial announcements. Which brings us right back to the beginning of this video. The thing that stands out to me most about Final Fantasy XV's development is how the scars of its frayed production can still be felt in every part of it. right down to the game's closing moments, which sees Luna and Noctis embracing in what I can only assume is some kind of wedding in the afterlife. We fade out to the title screen, which has now added Noctis sitting next to the figure of the woman in 15's logo, revealing her to have been Luna all along. Given how little the story was actually focused on Luna and Noctis' relationship, the pair only having a scant few flashback scenes and a single brief meeting in their entire adult lives, it's an odd note for the game to end on, but I think that's because this figure in the logo was never meant to be Luna. It was meant to be Stella. Final Fantasy XV's logo is one of the few aspects of the game to survive unchanged since its initial announcement, so this logo existed before Luna was ever conceived as a character. And given how much more emphasis Versus 13 seemed to place on Noctis and Stella's relationship, this would have presumably been a much more fitting end to that story. And ultimately, I think that's a kind of truncated version of what happened 15 in whole. It's a game haunted by the ghost of what it used to be. Even watching the rebranding trailer from 2013 reveals so many concepts and mechanics that never made their way into the final game. And I think the reason for that is that Final Fantasy XV didn't have a 10-year production. It had 7 years of massively ambitious and borderline insane pre-production, crippled with creative, productive, and scheduling difficulties, followed by 3 years of desperately trying to make an actual game out of those unfinished concepts. And the results can be felt everywhere, from its hollow world to its unbalanced combat to a story that's fractured and segmented to even its closing credits sequence. And I don't blame anyone who worked on the project. Both Nomura and Tabata still speak with an earnest enthusiasm about the game that makes me feel like they were always trying to do their best with the resources they had. And I don't doubt the tens of thousands of hours of very hard work that was poured into this game by hundreds of extremely talented people. And I don't mean for this video to belittle their efforts. But I think ultimately what you have with Final Fantasy XV is what happens when unrestrained creative ambition comes crashing into the realities of video game development. And I don't think pointing that out puts me above or makes me more knowledgeable than anyone who actually worked on it. All I am is a guy getting angry about a video game on the internet, which means I'm nobody. But regardless, I hope it's clear at this point that I love Final Fantasy, and that I wouldn't have made this video if I didn't. Friends, thank you for joining me today. A little announcement, I'm going to be at JCon in Dublin on Saturday the 6th and Sunday the 7th of October, so 1 week from the launch of this video, where I'll be hanging out and doing some panels, so drop by if you're in the area. I want to give a massive shout out to my patrons on this video. A video like this is only possible because of the amazing support I've gotten from them, so if you are one, thank you so much for making this possible. And if you would like to become one, head on over to patreon.com/supereyepatchwolf. A massive personal thank you this week to Brian Thomas Gossett, The Greato, Dustin Robbins, Vincent O'Regan Walsh, ODMP, Buckaroo Zoo, and Swag Daddy McPimp. If somehow you would like to hear me talk even more about video games, then you can do so over on the Let's Fight a Boss video game podcast, or find me on Twitter @eyepatchwolf. Friends, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.